Good afternoon. Welcome to the second installment of our Visions of Change series, an urgent and necessary platform to highlight diverse perspectives among opposition leaders in Venezuela in the lead up to the opposition primary and next year's elections. I'm Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to this Atlantic Council stage Maria Corina Machado, a longtime voice for democratic change in Venezuela. For many years, our work at the Atlantic Council has focused on how to concretely advance opportunities for a democratic solution to Venezuela's multifaceted challenges through our Venezuela Working Group, our Red de Apoyo, and many other initiatives that are rooted in the fact that solutions must come from the Venezuelan people, but that the U.S. and international community can be partners in accompanying Venezuelans on a path forward. In this sense, the presidential elections slated for 2024 are an opportunity to mobilize the Venezuelan people and to hold credible elections in which they have a chance to restore the country's democratic institutions. Even in Venezuela's current context, the upcoming election provides a chance for the Venezuelan opposition to advance their connections with the Venezuelan people, to convince them that engaging with politics is a way of improving their daily lives, and to show that a democratic path forward is possible and can and must be achieved. What will also be watched is the extent to which there is unity behind the winner of the opposition presidential primary, which will be held on October 22nd. For this reason, we launched our Visions of Change series and have invited all Venezuelan opposition primary candidates who, according to credible surveys by Moore and Data Analyses pollsters, have a favorability index above 15%. In addition to today's conversation with Maria Corina Machado, 2 weeks ago, we hosted Enrique Capriles, and we've also invited Benjamin Rauseo, Delsa Sorosano, and Manuel Rosales. Throughout this series, we delve into a variety of topics: the economic crisis, human rights abuses, the humanitarian emergency, and the future of democracy. We seek to not only understand the challenges, but also to amplify possible solutions put forward by the Venezuelan opposition. In this context, I am thrilled to have with us here today Maria Corina Machado to share her perspectives. Ms. Machado is a known inside and outside Venezuela as one of the most outspoken critics of the government of Nicolás Maduro. Her leadership and widespread popularity gained her a seat in the National Assembly after receiving the most votes among all candidates during the 2010 parliamentary elections. Today, she is known for her unique voice in Venezuela's traditionally male-dominated political landscape, as well as for her unwavering commitment to the rule of law and free market solutions. This series is not just about listening to speeches. It's about fostering dialogue and sharing perspectives with all leading voices in Venezuela's opposition, who have dedicated their lives to fighting for a more democratic and prosperous Venezuela. Ms. Machado, thank you so much for being with us today. I look forward to an opportunity to listen, learn, and identify ways to unite in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. I'll now turn the program over to Jeff Ramsey, Senior Fellow in Venezuela and Colombia here at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, who will get us started with a brief conversation before turning to questions from our audience. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thank you all for being with us here today, for participating virtually in this timely discussion with Ms. Machado. And before we get started, I just want to echo what Jason said. We know, Ms. Machado, that you've been the victim of an arbitrary ban on leaving the country since 2015, so you're unable to join us in person. But we are absolutely honored to have you with us here virtually in the face of the repression that you're up against. To get started, Ms. Machado, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself with our audience. What's maybe one thing that you think a Washington-based audience doesn't already know about you?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all the Atlantic Council, Jason Marzak and Doug Ramsey, Senior Director and Senior Fellow of the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center, as well as all of you who are joining us today. I'll take this minute to provide an idea, not about me, but about Venezuela, that probably not everybody knows yet. And I'll start saying that I bring certainly good news, because we are in front of a true and real possibility to put an end to the longest tragedy Venezuela has ever suffered. First of all, I want to convey three ideas. One is that the humanitarian catastrophe, the collapse of our economy, the migration that is grown, rampant corruption, will not stop unless we defeat and dismantle the criminal tyranny, the narco state that has been established in Venezuela and that has relations with rogue states from other continents. Secondly, that Nicolás Maduro can be defeated in next year's presidential election. And third, that in our case, what we will build in that scenario, the outcome would be a win-win situation, first and foremost for the Venezuelan people, in terms of our life standards and the possibility of bringing our children and our family back home, but to all other stakeholders, creditors, investors, private contractors, other Latin American countries, and even the United States and its population. So you're facing a real, true, huge opportunity in 2024, and we must all concentrate it in having it successfully achieved.
Well, let me ask you about that. After years of abstaining from elections, the Venezuelan opposition is once again embracing the idea of electoral participation as a path forward. You've become known as perhaps one of the biggest critics of the idea of participating in elections while the Maduro regime remains in power. Why do you think it makes sense to talk about participating in elections now? Has anything changed that leads you to believe that perhaps 2024 is an opportunity when in the past electoral participation was not?
Well, Mr. Ramsey, I think that first we should not confuse the goals and the means. I certainly support all legitimate means to achieve freedom and to stop the tragedy in Venezuela and democratic transition. And certainly you might remember that I usually came to public life promoting and working in an NGO that promoted free and fair elections called Sumete 20 years ago. And I've been very much involved in fighting for electoral integrity in Venezuela. Nonetheless, the fact is that we've had over 30 elections under the Chavez and Maduro regime, and every election has been under worse and worse conditions. Some people believe that not denouncing them is part of the electoral, of the democratic behavior in the country. I think that if we really want to have democracy in Venezuela, we have to denounce every violation to electoral integrity. And that's what I've done. So I do think that things have changed significantly from even months ago in three fronts: in the Chavismo and all the system, in the international community, and in Venezuelan society. Regarding the Chavismo and the regime, certainly they run out of gas, and that has consequences on their repression capabilities, in the possibility of putting in place social control through food and other handouts, and that's crumbling. That's absolutely collapsing. And in the third place, the conflicts within the family, the mafia families that the regime is formed by. In the international front, I would say that Maduro has turned toxic, and we just saw what happened with Lula a few days ago, starting to forgive Maduro with a wrong narrative, and it absolutely backfired on Lula. The same thing happened in the 25th of April to Petro, and he didn't manage to have all the Latin American countries supporting, removing sanctions before we have free and fair elections. And finally, you see how the International Criminal Court is advancing. Just yesterday, we've received the news that the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, here in Venezuela, decided to open an office for the ICC. So this is moving ahead. And the international community realizes that this is a criminal of crimes against humanity. And finally, perhaps the most important things that are changing The third front is what's going on in the among Venezuelan population. I mean, the desperation is huge, and a country that 5 months ago looked tired and without hope has turned out to the streets. And what I'm seeing is a strong movement building up, and the regime knows that.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned there's a sense of renewed hope, and it seems that part of that is linked to this primary process. Just a few days ago, we saw the opposition National Primary Commission formally request the government's National Electoral Council to provide technical assistance in the upcoming primary in October. You've raised concerns about this and said that the primaries should be conducted manually and without relying on the government's fingerprint matching machines. If those demands are unmet, will you still participate in this primary in October?
Well, first of all, I have to say that we are still in time of achieving what most Venezuelan people really, really want. And what I'm trying to be is a voice of what I hear, what I learn, what people tell me, what people ask me to do. We need the primary to be a milestone, a process and a milestone of building force, of building citizen strength. And in order to do that and to have high legitimacy, we want a very high turnout. And there are very good reasons for the Venezuelan people to not trust the CNE, the Electoral Council. And what people are saying is, all of us, Venezuelans, home and abroad, we want to participate. We have all the same rights. We have 1/4 of our population abroad. And secondly, we want to count our votes. We want to count our votes. And I think this is a unique opportunity to set a benchmark so that we have the right standards after the primary to go and fight for better conditions and to have competitive elections next year. We have to part from a reality nowadays. We don't have a date for the presidential election. We don't have terms and conditions, and the regime doesn't have incentives to give away those requirements that not only Venezuelan society but the international community are demanding. So it is a matter of how much strength we can build, and that's one of the main objectives of the primaries.
Well, I think you raise an important issue, which is, the objective is not necessarily the primary process. The primary process is meant as an opportunity to unite the opposition. But the real objective is the presidential elections in 2024. Recently, you've attracted attention for saying that con o sin primaria nos vemos en el 2024. With or without a primary, we'll see each other in 2024. What did you mean by that? Will you run in the 2024 election, even if you're not the opposition candidate?
What I meant is that those forces, which is not only the regime, there are other actors that do not want a primary held. And that you heard talking about consensus, getting together and choosing among them who would be the new leader to face not only as a candidate, but as a leader in this citizen fight that starts the day after the primary. So those who think that Venezuela will stand losing the opportunity of a primary, which all it involves, are mistaken. The Venezuelan people will not stand it. And they should not and better stop the primary from taking place. And if they do so, and if there are no primaries, certainly I will run against Maduro next year.
Thank you. In the event of a democratic transition, Venezuela is going to need a figure who can unite the country, someone who can address the needs of the population while also representing all Venezuelans, both opposition and Chavista voters. If you were elected, what would your priorities be to unite a polarized and fractured Venezuela? And what message would you have for supporters of Chavismo?
Look, Mr. Ramsey, the regime, and starting with Chavez, tried to, and actually they managed to divide, to some extent, Venezuelan society in different lines or elements, rich and poor, races, religions, ages, and almost every single family suffered from that. Paradoxically, the destruction of our life standards and our lives and separation of our families have brought together Venezuelan society as never before. And what unites us now are not, ideological flags, or what values, what we long for. We want to live with dignity. We want to live in a country where we can all be included, where we have rule of law, and we're all equal in front of the law. We want to have our families together. This is something I hear all around Venezuela. Maria Corina, I want my kids back home. And this is something that is, transversal. You see this in the poorest and the richest sectors. And no matter what your ideological ideas are. So these have brought Venezuela together. And what Venezuela needs most is trust. Trust in each other and trust in a legitimate leadership that can be able to put back our country in track and put our country to leave behind socialism and poverty and really, demonstrate the whole potential we have, not only in our natural resources, but on our people. And I believe that's what we are building and what we represent nowadays.
The strategy of the United States and of the international community seems to be aimed at pairing pressure and as well as engagement with ongoing negotiations, essentially trying to extract concessions from the Maduro regime ahead of 2024 and beyond in the hope of some kind of reinstitutionalization of Venezuela's democracy. You voiced skepticism of the ongoing negotiations process, and you said that you think it's unlikely or even impossible to have meaningful negotiations until after the opposition primary process. How do you see those negotiations taking place? If you were to emerge from this primary process, what would be your priorities in any kind of negotiations? And what kinds of things do you think the international community could do to support any kind of negotiations in that scenario?
Yes, we must remember that we've had already 15 initiatives of dialogue. So this is not the first one. And the outcome have all been the same. The Maduro regime has gotten what they wanted: legitimacy, time, resources, money, and so on. So what we first have to say is why, and what makes this Mexico initiative, in my opinion, not able to have different results. First thing is that I believe that in these negotiations throughout the years, the Venezuelan people have not sat down at that table, not felt represented. That means that those who sit there in the name of the democratic sectors do not have the strength and the legitimacy to put in place a commitment, or to achieve a commitment from the regime. So again, the name of the game is how can we build strength, citizen strength, in order to be able to build up a new negotiation with a different outcome. And in that case, I go back to the importance of the primaries, because the primaries will have several outcomes. First, we'll have coordination among the different groups. Second, we will have unprecedented citizen organization, both within and abroad our country. Third, we will have the opportunity to create alliances, not only among political groups, but with other networks, union leaders, workers, the church, and so on. And finally, you will have a legitimate voice to be the interlocutor with the international community in order to build a sole strategy and not seeing what we are facing right now, that you have erratic and contradictory positions from important international allies. So I think a successful primary will set the frame for an important negotiation process that could achieve the critical elements and conditions for competitiveness for the electoral for the presidential election.
Thanks. Ms. Machado, I know we have some questions from some folks in the audience, but before we turn to others, I just wanted to ask you, no doubt many of the participants or the people that are watching this conversation online have questions for you about your position on the economy. If elected, what would your main priorities be to address economic inequality and the need for economic growth in Venezuela? What's your proposal, for instance, for the urgent need for investment in Venezuela's energy sector?
Well, as you all are aware, Venezuelan institutions all are in ruins, in shambles. The judiciary, the health system, the education system, the security system. So where do we start? And back again, I go into trust. We need to build trust among people because we will have to work together and hard, and among international actors because we will need huge investments from multilateral agencies and certainly from private investors, as well from our creditors. We need trust from them in order to go through us through a process of restructuring of our debt that will be beneficiary for all of those involved. So I'll start by saying we need to leave behind and forever socialism. Venezuela, the story of Venezuela is probably the story of the most outrageous failure of socialism in history. We are an oil-producing country, the only one in the world that has hyperinflation for 3 years. I mean, it's because of how our country has been sacked. But we have to take care of the people, and people will demand results in the very short term. So we will need to work on different layers of this multi-dimensional crisis from day one. We will have to take care of the humanitarian catastrophe and at the same time start a reasonable, sustainable, and trustworthy revamping of our economy and our judiciary system, and certainly progressive taken control of our territory, which is half of it today under the control of criminal and foreign groups.
Thank you very much, Ms. Machado. And now I want to give the opportunity to a few people who are watching us online to ask a few questions. Let's go first to Andreina Itriago, who is a Venezuela correspondent for Bloomberg News. Andreina, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Jeff, Maria Corina. I wanted to ask you, considering the importance of the armed forces and their relevance over some of the, their influence over the decisions that those ruling Venezuela are doing recently, and also considering that some of their members have committed serious crimes against human rights, what's your offer as a presidential candidate to the military, to the armed forces, to guarantee their support, but at the same time to guarantee that those who have been their victims have justice?
Thank you, Adrienne. I think that no one in Venezuela knows better the magnitude of the crimes and corruption that high ranks in the Venezuelan armed forces are committing than the other members that are not involved into this kind of crimes. And they see it every day, and they see their families suffering every day as the rest of the Venezuelan families. We realized that this was an intentional strategy, first from Chavez and followed by Maduro, because they knew that a professional institutional armed forces wouldn't ever have permitted our sovereignty be given to Cuba, and the integrity of our territory would have been defended. We are at the risk of losing a strategic territory such as La Guayana Esequiba, Territorio Esequibo. So they know what's going on, and they have suffered fear because they have been infiltrated by Cuban agents with Russian technology, and certainly many have paid for it. Right now, we have 285 political prisoners. Above them are military that have been tortured. Their families have been persecuted and damaged, and certainly they have used it as an example to the rest of the forces. What I have to tell you is that I travel around my country by car, because I'm not allowed to buy a domestic plane ticket since 6 years ago. So I do have the possibility to interact with many members of our police and armed forces. And I can assure you that this desperation that I'm seeing in the rest, that you see in workers and union leaders that are protesting day after day, is the same as these other military citizens feel. So if we can deliver, and we're working on that, the clear message that they will be part of a process of transition, building not only a new country, but a new armed forces, that justice will be put in place, and that in the future we'll be assured that the armed forces serves the nation and never again a political party. I believe they will be, they will have incentives to follow Constitution the day of the presidential election. That means recognizing the new president of Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Maria Corina. Now let's go to Joe Daniels from the Financial Times. Thanks for being with us, Joe.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, I wanted to ask, so we're seeing, again, fuel shortages across Venezuela. What is the cause of them? And if elected, what would you do to guarantee the availability of gasoline at the pumps?
Well, thank you, Joe. I'm very grateful for your question because I didn't answer completely John's previous one regarding energy. And as you say, nowadays, we're seeing the most tragic scenes. We're seeing that producers of tomatoes in El Estado Trujillo throwing their crops in the rivers because there's no gasoline, no gas, no diesel to move their trucks and carry these food to a whole country who's suffering from hunger. So imagine what Venezuelan people feel when people are dying from hunger and you see our crops being thrown out because there is no gasoline. Our country that has the highest reserves in the world and that used to export gasoline and gas oil in the past. So the reason is evident. I mean, the regime has destroyed our infrastructure. They have sacked and robbed and dismantled many of the infrastructure and sell it abroad. And the situation is critical. But what I want to assure you is that Venezuela, under my government, will turn into the energy hub of the Americas. There is no other country in our hemisphere that has the resources and the potential that we do, both in conventional and in renewable energy. And that will require certainly huge investments from local and international companies. And we will go through a process of opening markets upstream and downstream in the oil and gas and other sources of energy, clean energy, hydro, wind, solar, hydrogen, and so on. And certainly that will require creating a strong independent judiciary, rule of law, and changing some laws in order for a total open and competitive market to be developed. And I will assure you that Venezuela will be, once again, and more than ever, a reliable supplier of energy to the whole Western hemisphere.
Thanks. That's a great question. If I could ask a follow-up on that, is there a role for the private sector in revitalizing Venezuela's oil sector?
Absolutely. I thought it was implied with what I said, but I am grateful that you insisted on saying it. We certainly need to go into a massive and transparent privatization process because Venezuela is broken. I mean, our debt is 200% our GDP. The IMF just published in April a whole debt of $158 billion by the end of last year. So how can we, within these conditions, even consider that Venezuela will have resources to invest in the oil sector. We certainly need the government to concentrate in rebuilding institutions, education, health, security, defense, and certainly have the private sector invest in every other sector. We will have dismantle monopolies, certainly. We will have a strong regulatory function for the state, certainly, but you need to open and make Venezuela attractive with our conditions of investment even more attractive than any other country around us, because we realize that we have a moral risk because of what Chavez and Maduro did to private investors. But certainly, there is no other country that can offer the returns of investments that Venezuela will. And also that will turn into benefits in life standards, in the quality of jobs for and services, public services for population, which is certainly my main concern.
Thank you. Now, I believe our next question is from Ana Vanessa Herrero, who is the Venezuela correspondent of the Washington Post and who joins us from Caracas. Thanks for joining us, Ana Vanessa.
Thank you so much, both. Maria Corina, my question goes in the same direction as Adriene's, because I think it's really important to understand that the power that Chavismo has right now supports itself on high ranks of the military. And that said, it's a military that has been accused by international and internal actors of being allegedly corrupt and heavily involved in illicit operations. So with this said, because Venezuela is such a militarized country, how do you see the transition with the armed forces? So what are you offering them to be a part of this transition? Because I think it's a little bit naive to think that any candidate that would defeat Chavismo or Maduro in the next elections would easily take on up to power without the armed forces. And do you have any direct channel of communication with them? Have you been talking to them? And in the same idea, to just round up this, do you think the elections will happen even without the military support?
Well, first of all, I talk to everyone, Vanessa. Anyone who wants to talk to me, I'm more than willing. And I certainly understand there's a huge risk in any military citizen of any rank to talk to me publicly. And I agree with you, it would be naive to think that those top ranking officials would give up power because they are involved. And some of them are, already part of the system. And they know what would expect to them. And I think that was a huge mistake, a previous, that for years international community made, was thinking that they could, come to terms with those very high officials that were totally, absolutely involved in crimes against humanity, narco trafficking, and so on. So once again, I think you need to create incentives. And that needs to be worked in different rounds, different fronts. One of them is what's going on in Venezuela right now in terms of how we can get the population once again enthusiastic, organized, activated, and certainly what the international community will do. But I believe all of these requires a legitimate leadership that both civil citizens and military will trust, that this will mean a true building of strong and robust institutions that get everybody involved, inclusive institutions, starting with the military. So I prefer not to elaborate much more. You understand, this is a crucial aspect, but I do think that the degree of control the regime had on the military and other groups is declining impressively in the last months. And I see it. I mentioned it the other day. I travel around the country, and the way they interact with me, the things they do, when they salute, when they mention me, what their families are suffering, I'm seeing something I have never seen before within the armed forces. Certainly, the regime is also measuring it, and that makes it very dangerous for all.
Ms. Machado, I want to follow up on something you mentioned, which is the fact that Venezuela's energy sector is in ruins, Venezuela's infrastructure is in ruins, but also the health system. In Venezuela, most public hospitals around the country lack water, basic equipment, food for patients. How would you address the needs of the public health sector? And is there a role for the private sector in responding to the health crisis in Venezuela?
Well, thank you for mentioning this, because I would say that health system and education system is absolutely in shambles. And we have to start from zero, John, from zero. And I think we should not look back and see what we had before. It goes beyond the number of beds or hospitals, of schools. We need to go back to the essence. What is what we want to offer in terms of coverage and quality for a prosperous nation, in terms of the quality, the standards, and so on. And certainly, we need to rethink completely our health system. Just to give you an idea, when you see the per capita budget, perhaps the U.S. is not a good example, but you guys have over $10,000 a year in per capita investment in health. Colombia has $350 a year, and has a pretty good system, by the way. And Venezuela is investing less than $100 a year per capita. So we have to, as I say, create the incentives so that we are very efficient with what we have. And we have to be very leverage on information technologies so we can, save that gap. And I believe there's a strong role both for the public sector and the private sector in insurance, because we have to have universal coverage, and certainly as a provider. And I believe that both profit and non-profit private sectors will have a huge role to play, and the government, once again, should have a regulatory and certainly acting in sectors where there is no competitiveness for the private sector to intervene. This needs like a much longer time to elaborate. I would love to do it, as well as our educational proposal, which is huge, it's transformational, certainly.
Excellent. No, and we'll have to save that for the next one, perhaps. I did want to ask you, though, just going back to the issue of negotiations. We saw it after the recent international conference in Colombia. It really seems like the consensus of the international community is that there needs to be a Venezuelan-led solution through some kind of political talks that can lead to a democratic opening in Venezuela. You said that you think meaningful negotiations can't happen until after the opposition primary, in order for the opposition to legitimize its leadership. Now, what about the format of those talks? What about the agenda? I mean, what do you think about the existing structure of these negotiations? And let's say if you were to emerge victorious in October, what would you change about the current negotiations process that began in Mexico City?
Well, I'll start by the negotiators, certainly on our side. And I do think that you have to create an agenda that is feasible and that is relevant. And you have to bring into it all other actors that have interest in Venezuela, which are many. Some are nowadays aligned with the interest of democratic interests of our people, and some are not. And but if you can prove all of them, that this will be a win-win solution, and that we are certainly open to channels for those involved from the regime to do what it takes, I think we can move ahead. But the fact is that so far, what we've seen is that a lack of strength, and in my criteria, leadership of who are handling those processes, and that they lack a social traction. I don't know if that's the correct way to say it in English, but la tracción popular, so that truly you can have a threat in terms of what this social strength and movement can mean. And I think that would be the main difference, certainly.
And what exactly do you think the opposition can do to rebuild that social fabric, to reconnect with the population that maybe isn't convinced by the same old faces in the political sphere?
Well, I would say you have to listen to the people. You have to listen. I mean, Venezuelan people today cry for issues that are very deep, very profound. Certainly, the economic situation is horrible, and it's worsening by the hour. The people do want to live with dignity and respect and solidarity, and we realize that the only way to do that is that we have to dismantle and defeat this regime. And in order to do that, you need to have a leadership you can trust. And I think that's why in 5 months, as we said before, Venezuela has totally changed. Not in the way the regime has tried to solve last year and before, but the country that looked green and hopeless at the beginning of the year, believe me, what I'm seeing is very impressive. I reached towns that lack gasoline, that lack electricity, that lack water, and I expect to meet with 100, 200, 300 people, and suddenly 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 appear. Some of them have been walking for a couple of hours under the sun on their own, because there's this enormous demand and expectation for change. So people do want to have things change. And I repeat once again the importance the primaries have in this process, and that's the reason why the regime is trying to block them and stop the primaries from taking place. And that's why I think the international community should support the primaries as a transparent, open, inclusive process.
Let me ask you one final question on that point. We are getting close to time, but I'd like to follow up there. You mentioned that the opposition has struggled for years with unity. Knowing that, do you agree to fully participate in this primary election and endorse whoever emerges in October, regardless of who it is?
Well, I think that the Venezuelan people know me. I'm a fair player and a person of honor, and certainly in conditions that are free and fair, I will certainly respect the results, whatever they are.
Thank you very much, Ms. Machado. I really want to reiterate what Jason said at the beginning about how honored we are to have you with us. Thank you very much to Andreina, to Joe, and to Ana Vanessa for participating. The reality is that, Ms. Machado, your commitment to democratic change, your unique voice in Venezuela is exactly why we're so excited to include you in this series. At the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, we are dedicated to working for a peaceful, democratic solution to Venezuela's crisis. And in this sense, we see the upcoming elections in 2024 as an important opportunity. But we also know that the best hope for change will depend on the opposition's ability to unite behind a single candidate who can inspire the Venezuelan people. Maria Corina, any last message you'd like to leave our audience with before we close?
Yes, please. Because as I said before, the most important objective and task and purpose I've found in this struggle is to bring back Venezuela together. And that means uniting every single family. I myself have my 3 kids abroad, and I share this with every other family in Venezuela. There's no one family that is, close together right now. That means that 1/4 of our population is living around the world. And they are a huge asset in this struggle. And I want to send to every Venezuelan living abroad right now my support, but also my invitation to use all the strength they have, the possibilities they have, to join together in this cause. Our diaspora is huge, over 7 million Venezuelans. We managed to achieve, with the work of many, that their vote will be allowed in the primaries in October 22nd. So we're in the middle of a period where they can register in order to vote, but also they can do much more. They can speak out, they can organize, they can make the world understand how committed our nation is to move ahead and to do what it takes to defeat this regime next year and to build a country that will make all of us very proud of, that we will be very proud to call the Venezuelans ourselves Venezuelans. So thank you for this opportunity. These are exciting moments. I want you to know how profound this strength and this citizen movement is growing by the day. And I am very hopeful because I trust the Venezuelan people and I know them. And we will prove the world what we are able and capable once it takes and what it takes to achieve freedom and democracy for our country. I think. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Machado, and we certainly share your enthusiasm and hope for next year. That's why for this Visions of Change series, we've actually invited all opposition candidates in Venezuela who, according to surveys from More and Data Analysis pollsters, have a favorability rating of more than 15%. In these conversations, we generally seek not only to understand the situation inside Venezuela, but also to amplify possible solutions and possible ways forward to address Venezuela's crisis. Please join us for our next event in the Visions of Change series on July 17th at 1:30 p.m. That's 1:30 in Washington and Venezuela time, featuring opposition presidential candidate Delsa Solórzano. We've also invited Enrique Capriles, who joined us 2 weeks ago, as well as Benjamin Rauseo and Manuel Rosales, who we look forward to hosting in future events in the coming weeks as well. Thank you again, Maria Corina Machado, for your participation in today's event, and thank you all who have tuned in, and we look forward to seeing you on July 17th.